Hey everybody, welcome to Pro Wrestling Musings, the show where you spend the entire time wondering how we could find pro wrestling statistics so interesting until you realize the interest was in your heart all along. Joining me today is, well, Scott Gigney. First time we've seen him on the show. Scott, thank you so much for being here. And a very special guest, someone that I'm very, very happy to get on. He is only the Lord of all that is wrestling statistics, the Baron of brutal numerical facts, the monarch of massive grappling knowledge, the man who created Pro Wrestling Musings itself, and the man who's responsible for us being here right now. It is Craig Leask. And Craig, thanks so much for coming on with us today. And I want to ask, before we get into everything that we have going on today, talking AEW, talking New Japan Cup, I want to ask you, why did you find pro wrestling statistics so interesting, and what brought you to creating this project here, Pro Wrestling Musings?
All very, very good questions. Quite the introduction there. I prefer to describe myself as good at counting, or counting with flair. Why did I? Well, I did that thing that everybody does on Twitter, where you get a Twitter account, follow a bunch of people, and never tweet anything. But because you don't really, wrestling's a niche interest, so wanted to get involved with kind of the chat online. Did what everybody does to begin with, and just said whether or not matches were good, rated matches. Turns out I'm not very good at rating matches because it very much depends on my mood. Not the best at being objective about that. So I was kind of having to think about how I could do something different, something creative, and started off with doing title history kind of bar chart type things. If you look on the YouTube channel way back, there's IWGP Championship, days held, house held up. I think those are quite interesting. And then I was just kind of out for a walk thinking about, prompted a little bit by the suggestion that AEW is going to be doing stats, prompted a little bit by New Japan Pro Wrestling talking about stats, like win-loss stats on their programming, and mainly prompted by my considerable interest in football. No, sorry, America, no actual football, the game where they kick the ball with their feet, football. And how in a football game, 0-0 draw, but one of the teams had 80% of possession, 17 shots on target. The other team had 20% and 2 shots on target. So, it adds that extra layer of kind of understanding or analysis to sport. And when people start talking about wrestling statistics, that's where my mind went to. So, I just tried to do it and kind of did it, really.
Interesting. And I'm a big soccer fan myself, football, whatever we want to call it. So I'll let that jab stand because I'm a fan. But I definitely agree with you. I think the statistics really help enhance your viewing of the product. And when it comes to pro wrestling, we talked about this last week. I'm sure we'll talk about a lot today. Is the fact that AEW, you can see through the statistics how thoughtfully they put their matches and stories together, because these statistics, they match up from week to week. We were just talking about before we went on air, talking about how Orange Cassidy and Darby Allin, for example, they tend to fight the same matches from week to week. The matches don't look the same, but the style tends to be the same. And it makes sense, because if you're an athlete, you don't change your style randomly from week to week. And you were talking about Jon Moxley. He's grown as a wrestler. His style has changed gradually since he got into AEW, became the champion, and then held the belt. His style has really developed, and the statistics are what allow us to look at that and understand, really quantify what we are looking at from a booking perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that word there is key, quantify. It does. The common one is wrestling podcasters will be like, oh, they controlled 90% of the match. And usually what the statistics actually show, or the way that I have interpreted how to come up with a match percentage, is when commentators, podcasters or whatever are saying 90%, usually it's 65, 70 at a push. yeah, which is you don't need those numbers to challenge what people are saying or whatever, because the point still stands. But yeah, it's just quantifying things.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. I absolutely agree with that. As I mentioned, we do have a third person here. So Scott, I don't want to leave you out, because of everyone I know, Scott might be the person who is most adept at telling me the in-depth things that I want to know about wrestling stories. It's hard to describe, but I know what Scott excels at. And so, Scott, I want to ask you, as we move into talking about this last week's AEW Dynamite, what really caught your eye from this show?
Oh, thanks for the introduction there, Griff. I would say for me, it was the performance of John Silver, to be perfectly honest. I thought he was absolutely sensational. I think AEW have got a real star on their hands there. And I think that he was maybe unlucky on the night not to win that belt.
Well, it's interesting when we talk about John Silver and we reference the stats that Craig and I were just talking about, specifically when it comes to Darby Allin, that Silver ends up controlling 63% of that match. So to Craig's point, what he was saying earlier, that, commentators, podcasters would say, oh, he's got 90% of the match or something like that. But from Silver's perspective, he was dominant for a lot of that time. But for Silver, I think it was an interesting place to put him in because he is small in terms of height. I mean, obviously he's a giant in terms of build, but you don't usually see guys his size, his height, dominate matches like this. But what I was seeing while he was running wild, and to your point, I think he looked fantastic. What I was seeing was the potential for a guy even of this height to be dominant potentially against bigger opponents.
Well, Chris Benoit did it. I know it's a dirty word,
true.
but and the Dynamite Kid before him as well. So those are both guys who went far, not being big guys at the time, particularly up in New York.
That's true, and that was at a time where there was much, much more of a kind of invisible wall, if you will, a glass ceiling between guys of that height versus the giants that we were seeing at the time.
That was the land of the dinosaurs, wasn't it? No one was under 6'5" that Vince was pushing, that's for sure.
That's absolutely true. I want to look at the offense totals graph here, the line chart that we have, and this calculates percentage of offense in 5-minute periods, and of course put together by Craig. This to me is really interesting because what you see is a very typical babyface match, or a babyface in peril match, I should say, where John Silver is controlling most of this match for basically the entire time. The match was 13:52. That was the total match time. And at 13:51, Darby Allin finally gets the advantage on offense, and that's the point where he gets the win. Do you guys think that this kind of booking works for Darby Allin and more broadly works for a champion in a major wrestling company?
Can I just jump in first, Craig, if that's all right?
Go for it.
Yeah, I don't think it hurts him at all. I think it shows that he can fight tough all the way to the end. So I don't think it hurts him. But I also think it does tremendously for John Silver. I think, you can say I had a tough fight, but the point is I came out champ at the end of the night. So I don't think it hurts him at all in the long run.
I do agree with that. I wonder, how many? I wonder if there's a shelf life on that. I wonder how many times he can do that. If he's holding on by the skin of his teeth, if that's what always happens with Darby Allin, how long can you do that before it becomes too much of a trope? Depending whether or not, I suppose it depends how well they hide that, how well the stories are going. Because I was thinking about when John Cena did it, when he did his famous US title run,
right.
And he essentially did that. He essentially he gave himself to his opponents, to Cesaro, to Neville, to Sami Zayn, to whoever it was.
Kevin Owens.
And it was all, exactly. And I suppose because he's a big guy, it maybe doesn't look. It doesn't look like it's so booked. It was more like this is
right.
just a really good champion that everybody gets themselves into their kind of best performance to go up against. Whereas for Darby Allin, if he beats Silver and then if he beats Archer and whatever else is going to come, and if it's always like this, I don't know. I don't know how that'll wash with fans, or if every now and again he needs to, I don't know, maybe dominate somebody for a bit more with submission just to establish that he is a talented guy. He's not like underdog champions are hard. I think there's a reason why, the chase, when you look at guys like Bryan and Daniel Bryan and Kofi Kingston, the chase was wonderful, but when they became champion, the company didn't really know what to do with them. So I don't know, it'll be really interesting to see how, a company like AEW, who are more nuanced, I think are kind of borrowing things from television a lot and, sourcing creativity, if they'll come up with how to beat that conundrum, or if, Darby Allin might be losing that title sooner rather than later.
May I just make a point about Darby and John Cena? I mean, obviously, there's the exact parallels are there. Obviously, notwithstanding the fact that he's not John Cena, but the difference, the little wrinkle that they actually did right in the WWE is John never knew he was facing until that music hit. Now, if Darby was employing a similar sort of thing, it wouldn't matter so much if he was getting his ass handed to him every week, because he wouldn't have known, he wouldn't have been able to prepare. So he did give out the challenge, and obviously John Silver answered, but he still knew it was going to be him.
Right.
So that was just a little wrinkle that they did well for WWE.
It's a really interesting perspective, because I've talked about, when it comes to the power rankings over on the site, every week I talk about Darby Allin and how much his booking works for me, because generally speaking, I think if you overanalyze, which is something that we specialize here on Pro Wrestling Musings, if you really analyze a babyface,
just a little bit,
yeah, exactly. And if you're really looking at it, a guy like John Cena, for me, before I heard what you guys were saying, it was never believable to me if John Cena's behind. Because you're looking at him and you're like, this man is like carved out of marble. How the hell can he be behind in all of these matches? It's not possible. It would be like it would be like if the Chicago Bulls in '98, or for you guys, it would be like if the Arsenal Invincibles had to come from behind every single match, and it's like, that would make no sense, because we see the quality that is on display. It doesn't make sense. But what you and versus Darby Allin, who is much smaller than all of his opponents, so it makes sense for me for him to come from behind. But you guys make really good points that from John Cena's perspective, it is kind of believable for him to have to come from behind, because for Cena, he is going through these matches every week, and the guy who's coming out to answer that challenge, that's the match of his year right there. That's the biggest match, and for some guys, it's the biggest match of their career, right in that moment, facing John Cena. And for Cena, that's like the fourth title match in the last 2 months or whatever. And for Darby Allin now, we're kind of leaning into that point where, to your point, Craig, it's like, at what point does it start to become boring? Like at this point, if every match of Darby Allin's is about 15 minutes and the first 10 are the other guy getting the heat, whether he's face or heel, because I think John Silver's a face at this point, but we've also seen heels get the heat against Allin as well. So if that's going to be the case, then at what point do we just say, all right, the first 10 minutes of this match don't matter, because it's Darby Allin getting his ass handed to him for 10 minutes, and then we switch on to the last 5-10 minutes. That's the real match where we find out who's going to win. So I think that is a concern, but to kind of play devil's advocate here, what really works, I think, about Darby Allin is that every kind of spurt of offense that he gets, it means something. Like, it's different than a babyface in peril, where it's like the heel's getting the heat, and then the babyface teases a comeback, and then the heel puts him down, gets more heat, and then we just keep doing that until the babyface finally gets his comeback. For Darby Allin, I mean, you can see again with the statistics that it's not just Allin going, kind of like trying to get the comeback, getting shut down, and then getting beaten down, and then trying to get the comeback. Because if you look at the offense totals, what you see is Silver consistently dominating Allin for the first 10 minutes, and then Allin gradually getting more and more and more into the match as we go on. It's a much more believable way to do it, I think, for Allin, and a guy who he's thrown 20 strikes in this match. He's reversed 16 times to look at those stats. This isn't a guy who's just been getting his ass handed to him the whole time. It's a guy who's trying to fight back, and finally he's found his way into the match, and he continues to get better as the late stages of the match play on. I think with that little nuance, it might have a little bit more shelf life for Allen to be the babyface in peril.
It would have had a lot more shelf life as well if they hadn't have called it the TNT title and not put them on TV every week.
No, I agree with that. That whole Sting thing, I think, might have damaged him a little bit.
Yeah.
I would say that, like, if they did want to add another wrinkle to him, he's out submitted John Silver there, and quite often submission time is used as like a big grinding tool. So the guy that's getting beaten down, the underdog, the opponent often uses more submission. So like in this situation, you'd expect to see that on Silver, seeing as he was in that role, like him using more submission, whereas Darby Allin's done that. So like if you do want to give him a couple of weeks where like he's maybe frustrating the heel and he is dominating the match a bit more, if you put him up against a heel, where all the heels in my brain, somebody that's not big, Ricky Starks, although they've kind of done that, but let's use Ricky Starks as an example. If he's frustrating Ricky Starks, if they're presenting Allen as the super skilled TNT champion, that's the champion because he's so skilled, that submission stat could be key. Like that could be his thing. And he's really quite technical. When you watch the way he does submissions, he's convincing. He's different for a little guy. And when you look at his image, you don't expect him to be this kind of cerebral submission guy. Yeah. I know that's like a shallow point of view, but you know, there's some of that. It's wrestling.
Well, to be fair, that's kind of it's how he was presented early on. I mean, when Dynamite first started, and even before that, when Allen was on some of the pay-per-views they were doing, they really positioned him as a hardcore wrestler, and the tagline was he's impervious to pain. That was his whole thing, or indifferent to pain, I think it was. That was his whole thing. So to be fair to you, the image that he's cultivated is not the image of a very technical submission wrestler.
Yeah. And what was also interesting about this is, so he's got 20 strikes there. Until the 10-minute mark, his entire offense for the match was that 2 submissions, 9 seconds and a 45 seconds, making up, and that was very early in the match. And then he had 6 strikes, various wee bits of those 10 minutes. And then the point where Darby Allin started to like come alive in this match, he hit 7 strikes in a row. So he more than outdid his whole total for the match to that point. Wow. And at that point, so just after that 10-minute, it becomes a seesaw battle. Until then, John Silver kept cutting him off. So I don't know for Darby Allin if that suggests to me that he's a momentum wrestler and he needs to be hitting those momentums earlier on, whether it's going back to that resilience, his opponent was getting tired, he's so resilient, he then finds a kind of nuke into the match. But Darby Allin is interesting, one of the most interesting wrestlers in AEW, if not the most fascinating.
It's a fantastic point that you bring up there about how those statistics change, because when you said earlier that we can position Allen as the babyface, not in peril, but the babyface who gives up a lot of the offense but frustrates the heel as the match goes on until that point where he can turn the tides. And what you've just said, I think, perfectly illustrates that, because you're talking about a guy who threw almost no strikes for the first 10 minutes of the match, but he locks in these submissions and he's getting all of these reversals, and that is frustrating the heel. And then when Allen is ready to turn that corner and turn it on, that's when he starts throwing the strikes. That's when he starts going for the dives. And if you look at our styles statistics over on ProWrestlingMusings.com, he is actually classified as a flyer in our stats, so he can do that as well. But he doesn't until he knows he can get the advantage while doing it, and that's a wrinkle in that character that I never really thought of before.
Yeah, and the other thing, like this is perhaps when I was talking about the kind of shelf life idea before, people become bored of this. You know, you can almost skip the first 10 minutes because you know what's going to happen. Allen gets beaten down, and then eventually, last 5 minutes, we find out who wins. But if AEW were to be like, for his last like 5 matches, Darby Allin has had a match offense of 30%, 34%. You know, it's all low. That's the storyline. Like then you're watching the match. Can this guy that's wrestling Darby Allin, he's beating him down, but we kind of know that doesn't actually work. Is he going to overwhelm Darby Allin more than anybody else ever has done, to the point that he actually breaks? And then you have Darby Allin promoing about, I don't have a breaking point, you can't do that. And then maybe you know, somebody eventually does, or maybe you end up at the start of a match and you've got a conniving heel that just like kind of refuses to like actually do much to Darby Allin, is like maybe sits down on the floor like, oh no, come on, you attack me. Like, I don't know, somebody you could do something with this. You really could. It's all there, you know.
Yeah. I'm thinking, if we kind of fantasy book this out a little bit, if it's going to be, let's say, Scorpio Sky that ends up taking that TNT title off of him, good. Then what you would end up doing, you want to build Scorpio Sky up as a heel. So I'd want to see him on Dark. I'd want to see him on Dark Elevation, a couple matches on Dynamite, where he's doing what Scorpio Sky is so good at, which is he is just a great, balanced professional wrestler. He does everything really well. But to really solidify that he is a real threat, I would love to see him do what you just suggested. He gets into a match against Darby Allin, and he realizes that he's not going to tire himself out the whole time. So he just stands there and waits for Allin to try to do something. And at that point, Allen's whole deal is, when I start throwing strikes, because I think the strikes and the high flying, that is indicative of when Allin feels like he's back in the match. That's when he feels like he can turn on the jets and start going for the win. If he has to do that when his opponent is not tired, when he's fresh, Allen's just throwing these strikes and Sky's like just shrugging them off like they're nothing. And now you end up in a situation where Darby Allin's actually the one who's tired, and this offense totals graph that we're seeing in almost every Allin match that looks exactly like it does against Silver, it's flipped. Allin's the one on top, and then Scorpio Sky decides now it's time for me to take over, and he turns it on, and then we see Sky's number shoot up like Allin's usually does, because now Allin is the one who's tired out. Sky's the one who's outsmarted him. And he's done it because, you know, a lot of times you want the baby faces to be smart. Obviously, you don't want your baby faces to look stupid, but you also want your heels, certain types of heels, you want them to be very smart. Like MJF, for example, is a kind of heel that you want him to be very smart. Sometimes you want him to act stupid, but it's no fun if the heel's just a dumb musclehead and the only thing he can do is just beat the hell out of you. Like, sometimes that works, but I think sometimes in Scorpio Sky's situation in particular, you want him to be able to outsmart Allin at this point and maybe take the title off of him and maybe extend the feud from there, where it's a very cerebral feud about how do you approach this match.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. In his other match against Sky, Darby Allin did a lot of submission at the start, again, like he did in this one. This was a couple weeks ago. And then at the end, like, Sky was all over him. Sky hit, 6 grapple slam type moves after the 10-minute match and their 13-minute match. Darby Allin was very much just reversed his way into a roll-up there. So, yeah, it is a pattern. Darby Allin against Scorpio Sky, 33% of the match rather than the 37 here. Yeah, less of everything against Sky, so he's very much the underdog in that one.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I want to move on to this, something else that I want to talk about. We reference a lot, obviously, the statistics, and this one, we're talking about Darby Allin, we're often referencing this specific match against John Silver, but something that is a real tool for us to be able to figure out how wrestlers, how they approach matches in general, beyond just looking at one match, is our per hour statistics, and those are up right now, ProWrestlingMusings.com. You can follow along with us as we're going through all of this. And to me, these stats, when we look at time, when we look at the per hour things like grappling and striking and all these kinds of things, it really helps tell a story about a wrestler's character in general. Craig, you're the one who obviously developed all of this and had this idea. Why are the per hour stats so important?
That's a really good point. You would be forgiven for saying, why don't you calculate wrestlers like per match? You're trying to find out who's like the best striker. Like, well, who uses the most strikes on a per match? You know, but the problem with that is some matches are 5 minutes, some matches are 30. So, for example, Darby Allin. What am I doing? I've lost my train. So I was trying to look for a good example. So Adam Page has wrestled 4 1v1 matches this year, 36 minute total. However, Darby Allin has wrestled 4 as well, but he's 49 minutes. Ryo Mizunami, 4 as well, 1v1 this year. She's up at 1 hour and 8 minutes.
Wow.
So, like, obviously you can't, like, match. That's not a fair, you know, you match by match is different. It will be whoever's been in the longer matches will probably have, like, more strikes per match. So if you do this timing, then it flattens it out. However, the only problem with this is it gives bigger per hour ratings to wrestlers that tend to have shorter matches because there's less, like, selling time. In a longer match, a wrestler will be, like, selling for a chunk of it, so there's, like, less happening. So in matches where more happens, you get bigger numbers. For example, the Young Bucks, lots happens in their matches. They're always offense rich. They would use, in an hour of wrestling, they would use on average 289 strikes, whereas another tag team, MJF and Jericho, when they were together, in an hour of wrestling, they would only use, on average, 118 strikes. So yeah, there we go.
It's a really interesting perspective because I have seen, you know, there's kind of this question about why would you do it, to your point, why would you do it per hour? And also more generally talking about what exactly does this show? Because like you said, this will change wildly based on how wrestlers approach matches. And so if you are the Young Bucks, then we know from a shoot perspective that the way they produce their matches is to naturally have less selling time. That's just how they do it. So that's what we know from a non-storyline perspective. However, I would say that what these statistics help do is tell the story from a kayfabe perspective, that even though we know the matches are structured so they sell less, what it actually means is in kayfabe, the Bucks are they just work at a much, much higher tempo. You know, it's like a basketball team that plays in the full court press. They just work at a higher tempo. They're going to score more points. They're going to give up more points because that's what they're forcing their opponents to do. And it's just another layer on top of that, where you look at the Bucks matches against FTR as a perfect example, where it's a total clash of styles. FTR is an old school tag team. They are going to make you work at their pace. And the Young Bucks are a team who are so fast paced that the story is FTR going to be forced to work at the Bucks pace, or are the Bucks going to be forced to slow it down and work at FTR's pace? So even from a kayfabe perspective, even though there's such wild differences in the way these matches are put together, I still think it's helpful to tell the story, or to understand the story that's being told.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just going to say, it's almost like it's in kayfabe, it's even more important, because you can say, well, look, the champions, they hit people more. They've hit more moves, and that's why the Young Bucks are the best in the world, because look at them, they're kicking everyone's ass, they're running around like lunatics, and the stats prove it.
Yep, I think you're absolutely right.
Go ahead,
Craig.
It's absolutely that, and I'm quite pleased with a lot of the time, because it does show up things that you would expect, and it shows up things that you might not expect. Like Adam Page has a better strike down rate per hour than kind of anybody else in the top 20 for total ring time. People say that Adam Page is a hard hitter, so that makes a lot of sense. Nyla Rose is using grapples more than a lot of people. She's seen as a big, powerful wrestler, so you would expect her to use grapples to put over that power. Kenny Omega's the other one using grapples. That makes sense, as Scott was just pointing out. He's the champion, and he might not be using strikes in the same manner as the Young Bucks, but he's putting himself over with grapples.
Right.
It seems to work. It seems to work.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I want to transition, talking from this, talking about the stats when it comes to the individual matches, to how the storylines that we're seeing play out in each individual match play into these broader narratives. And I want to start talking about this whole Bullet Club storyline that's going on, because I think when you look at Kenny Omega, a man who obviously so many of us believe is one of, if not the best wrestlers in the world right now, and one of the greatest of all time, he has his match against Matt Sydal, and for me, I think Kenny Omega, he made Matt Sydal go from like a mid-carder kind of, I don't want to say jobber, but a guy who will give a solid match to someone you're trying to push, to now you see Matt Sydal and you're like, put the TNT title on this guy. Like this dude needs some match
tremendous time. It was a tremendous match, wasn't it? Absolutely fantastic.
Yep, you are absolutely right.
I totally agree, Griff. Totally agree with everything you've just said, basically.
I think from Omega's perspective, again, this is about the stats that fuel the whole storyline. Omega, I feel like, he's wrestling wildly different styles of matches depending on who he's going against. And for his character, I think that actually makes a lot of sense, because on the one hand, he has been very open. He and Don Callis have been very open about saying Kenny Omega wants to be considered the greatest wrestler of all time. And that goes obviously from a shoot perspective, where in real life he also wants to be considered that. But from the kayfabe perspective, they're saying we want Kenny Omega to be able to excel. We want him to be the best at every single style. And so he changes his style based on who he's fighting, and he'll have really up-tempo matches like this one against Matt Sydal that obviously we all agree was a terrific match. And I think from the whole storyline perspective, it fuels this idea that Kenny Omega is like starting to crack a little bit, that he's starting to go just a little bit off the deep end almost.
He's coming off as being unhinged. It's definitely there. It's just at the surface. It's just coming to the surface now, but it is the tip of the iceberg, I feel.
Yes.
And with obviously with the Bucks turning their backs on him, I think that's going to sort of exacerbate that situation fairly swiftly.
Yes, absolutely. And so I want to ask you, Scott, when you look at this whole storyline with Kenny Omega going on right now, what do you think is the ultimate future for Omega and the Bullet Club in general?
Obviously, I can't really comment on the Bullet Club in Japan, but it's certainly in terms of the Bullet Club across AEW and Impact Wrestling. To me, I would think it would make sense to just be an all-out war and actually do what WWE should have done right with the Invasion. Actually, just make it a proper, just do a massive thing. I think they'd make massive amounts of money on that.
Wow. I actually hadn't considered that before. Craig, what do you think?
Well, I think a lot of people would get a lot out of that, because that kind of itch was never really scratched. People wanted, it's quite often held up as the biggest missed opportunity in the history of wrestling.
Right.
And it's been put down to Vince McMahon's ego. He didn't want to bring in the big hitters from WCW because he didn't want his guys to look weaker or whatever, or them to be WCW to be too interesting. I don't know what he was scared of, because the company was gone. But
he also didn't want to buy out their contracts.
Yeah, I think the money played a real factor.
A lot of people wanted to just sit at home and get paid the hundreds of thousands that they were due. So, that was part of the issue.
Well, after the way WCW was making them work in those last 2 years, I can't even blame them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Impact can't really. Impact can't bring that. They're not WCW they're neither of those two companies. So I don't know. They might want to keep it for some kind of New Japan thing. That would probably be more interesting. Bullet Club New Japan is maybe the invading force. You've got Suzuki-gun there as well that could fulfill that role. They've done it before in Noah, I believe.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think you're going to get more kind of touchy-feely stuff for a while. I think it's going to be more about Adam Page toppling Kenny Omega. I think that makes sense from a business decision, because to me, he's obviously the golden boy, the next in line, their big project. Mm-hmm. I think that makes a lot of sense. He's absolutely fantastic. And yeah, you're going to, in terms of, I don't know, I think as Scott's saying, like, it's very obvious that Kenny Omega, they're doing this unhinged thing. They were saying cracked on commentary.
Yeah.
I think the next step is for Kenny Omega to actually do something awful to the Bucks.
Interesting. And I would definitely like to see that. What I was thinking while watching this last Dynamite was, we remember how around this time last year, AEW was planning the Blood and Guts match, right? It was going to be kind of their take on War Games, and it was going to be the Inner Circle against the Elite, I think it was supposed to be. And obviously, plans for that got scrapped after the pandemic forced everyone into crowdless stadiums and everything that's happened after that. I really got the sense on this last Dynamite that we're headed towards Blood and Guts with Bullet Club, Kenny Omega, the Good Brothers, and maybe Kenta. I don't know who else they might add in there, but those guys against Moxley, Kingston, and the Bucks. That's kind of what I got the sense of, because Moxley and Kingston were cutting this promo, and Moxley had a great line where he's talking to the Bucks and he's saying, you better be ready to get dirty. And he said, we're playing with live rounds now. And to me, it's like they're setting up Moxley and Kingston are going to have this uneasy relationship with the Bucks, with the common enemy being Bullet Club. And Bullet Club, like you said, Craig, I think is going to go off the deep end. Kenny Omega is going to do something horrible to the Bucks, and that's what's going to set up our second chance at Blood and Guts, now that we can get fans back into the stadiums and watch this match. That's the sense that I got. Would that be something that you guys are interested in, or am I just totally going down the wrong path here?
Well, it'd definitely be a very, very interesting thing to see. I'd love to see how they manage that. It's a bit of a head trip, actually. I was just trying to think how you book it.
People have been bringing up, it's funny that you've gone Blood and Guts. It's been like the thing every time there's a faction feud. People are like, oh, Blood and Guts, it's happening. Sorry, that sounds quite harsh. I didn't mean it like that. That sounds like a wonderful match. I don't know. I'm a bit, like on the What Culture podcast, they bring it up once a month every time a faction looks at another faction, and the booking's always really good. The ideas are always really good. Mm-hmm. They were saying over on that podcast, they were saying it was definitely happening at Revolution. I don't know. I think in my head, I've just decided that Blood and Guts is never happening, because certainly What Culture podcast has teased it too much for me that I won't believe it until I see that poster again.
Yeah. It's a good point. I think what ended up happening, I think that people are still waiting for that, because a lot of us were so excited about the Blood and Guts match, and it ends up being canceled. And what they replace it with is the Stadium Stampede, which I absolutely loved.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was a great replacement for that. But I think because that feud went in the direction, the Inner Circle versus the Elite, it went in the direction of, I don't want to say comedy, because it was very serious, but there were comedic elements in it. Like, people were allowed to show a lot of personality.
Ever so slightly.
Yeah. And like
slight comedy. People were getting their bell rung literally, and having their like 4 lives brought to the forefront.
Right. Well, there was that scene of like Kenny Omega and Matt Hardy chasing Sammy Guevara in the golf cart. And
I'll never unsee that. I'll never unsee that.
That was fantastic.
Matt Jackson's 100 yards or whatever the American football, his north
right.
motion.
Oh no, the best bit for me was when Hangman came out to the middle and just ran all the way down to do the lariat.
Oh yeah,
that was absolute gold.
Most one you've ever seen, yeah.
What I loved, my favorite part of that match was not a part that anyone really talked about, but when they got into that ring that was just randomly placed in the middle of this field, Kenny starts doing the snapdragons to everyone, and what I loved was Santana avoided it like 3 times, and he was taunting Kenny, and then Kenny ultimately locked it in, and Santana straight to the hard cam, he just goes, oh fuck, and then he gets snapdragon. That was my favorite part of this match, but it just goes to show you, that AEW, they were able to really change gears so quickly and go from this very serious blood and guts match that they were planning to this stadium stampede that was serious and also very lighthearted in equal measure. By the way, we also forgot to mention Chris Jericho, Judas affecting the mascot. I absolutely love that as well.
I liked the line flags or whatever he did when he was protesting a call and they did the video replay.
Oh man, that was a great match. Go back and watch Stadium Stampede, even if you've seen it. That was a great match. But the point is that AEW really changed gears so well to get to that. And now it feels like we're getting into a much more serious storyline that's kind of going the opposite way. Like Bullet Club started, I don't want to say that it started like comedy because it obviously wasn't, but there was some of that kind of lighthearted stuff going on at the very beginning. I mean, you remember Kenta made in his first match in AEW, they did that, was it the 6-man tag against, I can't remember who it was all against. I know that Lance Archer was in it, but they had funny spots in there as well, like Kenta hitting Archer with a big potato.
Yeah,
and
there was a tag team match. Omega and Kenta against Moxley and Archer. That's
right. Thanks for reminding me. And so there was kind of some stuff that we see, I think, in New Japan where Bullet Club is obviously very serious, but they also they do some funny stuff as well. They kind of get some comedy out there. Now we're seeing the transition go into much more serious, and I think it will kind of solidify that if and when Kenny does something, really horrible to the Bucks, which I agree with you, Craig. It kind of seems like we're moving in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's not going to be very lighthearted, the storyline, when it happens.
The problem I have with it is then we'll have like double faction, doom, and it's going to be the Inner Circle and Pinnacle versus Bullet Club and the Bucks, and it's all going to be a bit much. I hope it isn't, but it feels like it might be.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because the Pinnacle is actually the next thing that I really wanted to talk about. Because we're talking about this kind of warfare between Bullet Club, and it's not really a faction that's developing with Moxley and Kingston and the Bucks. It's more kind of like
a loose alliance.
Exactly. But the Pinnacle, on the other hand, it obviously kind of in a holding pattern, waiting for whenever Inner Circle is inevitably going to come back, and the initial storyline will be Pinnacle versus Inner Circle. But I think from the Pinnacle's perspective, what I've seen early on is they've really done a fantastic job when it comes to faction storytelling. Sometimes you do treat groups kind of as a whole, and the Inner Circle very often were treated as just this conglomeration of people. And at one time, Jericho happened to be the world champion, but it was a group of people and they were treated like a group of people. It seems like the Pinnacle is much more willing to treat their own guys like individuals. Like I could very much see MJF doing something separate from the rest of the group. FTR, I think, inevitably is going to go after the Young Bucks for the tag team titles again, this time when we can get 50,000 people into a stadium to watch them. And I think it's something that's much different than what we've seen from factions so far in AEW. I don't know what you guys, we'll start with Scott. What do you think of what we've seen early stages from the Pinnacle here?
Well, I'll start by saying I thought Dax's promo was absolutely stunning.
Oh, yeah.
Never believed the man so much in my life. It was absolutely tremendous.
Absolutely.
I would suggest Dax is low-key one of the MVPs of AEW at the moment.
100%. It's just the crazy eyes at the end. And you wouldn't want to be, in a dark alley with the man unless he was at your back. But yeah, I absolutely agree. It's because they are basically the new Four Horsemen, aren't they? And that's Barry Windham always went off and did his own thing, and then they always came back together when it really counted, and they all got back behind Flair. So I think that the comparisons are there because that's what they want.
That's a good point. I think Evolution is similar in that, and obviously that first promo from Pinnacle, there was a lot of callbacks to when Evolution formed, with MJF going through and talking about each man's accomplishments and like shouting it into their faces, and like there was that moment that was very reminiscent of when Triple H was introducing the whole group, and they did a very similar thing where guys kind of went off and did their own thing. But then there was that time for Evolution where everyone was a champion. They all got the belts on, I can't remember what event it was, but they all got the belts on one night. And it really showed you that factions in wrestling, it doesn't just have to be tag teams, but with 10 people instead of 2. It can just be this alliance of people with a common goal. And AEW, I think, does a great job of blending storylines into one another. And I think for the Pinnacle, that could really work.
Yeah, it also makes a lot of sense in the context of what it is. Like the fictional fighting, whatever, you strength in numbers, it makes sense to group together. And what's interesting about this is in their debut match, the Pinnacle, they went 50-50 in terms of like numerics with the Varsity Blondes and Dante Martin. 50 match offense was 50% each. So I don't even think that's too much of a surprise if you were watching it. Like they didn't. It was quite an even match. They didn't really dominate the younger guys at all. Short, mind you, 6 minutes. So perhaps they didn't have enough time to really flesh out. How threatening they potentially were.
Yeah, but if I were to just tell you this match, Pinnacle, new group, taking on the Varsity Blondes and Dante Martin, it went 6 minutes. How much offense do you think the Pinnacle got? You'd probably guess somewhere in the 70s or 80s, because you'd say 6 minutes, that's just a long squash. And what we ended up getting was a very competitive match. And I think it goes into what I mentioned earlier about AEW blending storylines, because what happened right before that match was Christian Cage was talking to the Varsity Blondes and Dante Martin and giving them advice. And so from a kayfabe perspective, they went out there and they implemented that. They did exactly what Christian Cage told them. And at the end of the day, what happened at the very end of the match was FTR and Shawn Spears, they utilized their dirty tricks. They dipped back into that well of experience, the experience advantage that they all have over these 3 young guys, and that's what ended up getting the job done. But it's a great wrinkle in that story, I think. Yeah,
it really is. Lovely attention to detail.
Yeah, I would never put that together.
Well, maybe it's, what do we do here, Craig? We overanalyze wrestling, so that's...
Yeah, absolutely.
I wasn't even planning on talking about this, but when we're talking about AEW as a whole, and talking about what happened before this Pinnacle and Varsity Blondes Dante Martin match, Christian Cage makes his appearance, and we know now that Christian will be fighting his first match in AEW next week against Frankie Kazarian. From your guys' perspective, we'll start with Craig. How do you think we're going to see Christian be presented from an in-ring perspective?
It's probably not particularly nuanced to say as a veteran. Could be as a veteran, he needs to be, he's smart, he's reversing things. I don't think it needs to be too much more complex than that, really. It's hopefully they position him against the newer guys, so it's like the guy from New York is coming in and facing off against the AEW actual guys, although it's interesting that they've put him up against an old TNA hand. Maybe that's to help with his own nerves about going into the ring. Presumably he will have them, experienced or not. Good promo though. Frankie Kazarian was good. When does the work actually start? So that was good.
Yeah.
I think it's a perfect first match as well, to be honest. It gets Frankie on TV, which obviously he's going to be quite pleased about.
Right.
I think that they know each other. They know each other very well, and I think they'll probably go out there and say, "Let's put on a great match. Don't drop me on my head."
I feel like these two, they could probably have a 3.5 star match in their sleep. They've worked so much together in the past, and they're both industry veterans. They know what they're doing. So to me, the floor on this match is average. Like that's probably the worst it can get.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're so. They've always both been so fit. You don't see either of them get gassed. So that shouldn't be an issue either.
Yeah, that's a good point. To something that Craig brought up a second ago, talking about how Christian is presented, and specifically if you're going to position him against younger guys, I think it's kind of a tightrope you walk if you're going to do this with the veterans, and I believe they absolutely should. But if you put Christian against, if you take some of these younger guys, put him against Darby Allin, put him against MJF, Jungle Boy, Adam Page, like all these guys that AEW are trying to build into megastars, that's all well and good. And so Christian, if his first feud is with MJF, say, and he puts MJF over, that's great. His next feud's with Darby Allin. He puts Darby Allin over. Okay, that's fine. You get into that third, fourth feuds where it's like, okay, now I know that Christian's going to put the younger guy over, so I've totally lost interest. How do you keep people engaged in a veteran that ultimately is here to put a younger guy over?
He'll have to win.
Yeah.
He'll have to win. That's as simple as that. Otherwise, he's not credible, and there's no reason for him to be in the matches.
You need to take that Twitter backlash on the chin. If this guy's going to come in and he's going to have to beat some guy. He's going to, Jungle Boy could take a loss to Christian. MJF could not. MJF shouldn't be anywhere near Christian. Neither should Page, unless Page can beat Christian. Page can be one of the guys that beat Christian. Darby Allin shouldn't be anywhere near Christian. Ricky Starks could take a loss to Christian.
I've actually had an idea about this. You could do a series with Christian against Ricky Starks, where Christian keeps beating him until eventually Ricky Starks gets the upper hand, scouts him, and wins. And you can turn Ricky there, and you can say, "There you are, kid. You got it at last." And that's the loss he takes, and he puts him over huge.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's cool.
I think, talking about another veteran, I think Ricky Starks should have gone over against Sting in that street fight. I think you put Brian Cage, who is, you just see Brian Cage, and it wouldn't be believable at all to have a Sting in his 60s beat Brian Cage, who looks like a rhinoceros. Like, that wouldn't be believable in the least. And so you take Brian Cage out of that match. Now you got Ricky Starks. To me, that was the point where you give Ricky Starks the win right there, and you've got him. That's his rub for a couple years, because he's the man who beat Sting in AEW.
He'd be built. That'd be it.
Exactly.
It's as simple as that. Simple as that.
But
I still, sorry, Griff. I just still can't believe that people have a problem that Brock Lesnar beat the Undertaker. What else could possibly happen? This guy used to kill people for a living in a ring legitimately. Of course he was going to beat a 50-year-old. Simple as that. So I don't have a problem with it at all.
Well, I think, the comparison here is goes all the way back to what we talked about at the beginning of this show, where AEW does a really great job of being consistent from an in-ring perspective. And so if you had a situation where it was Brock Lesnar against Sting or Brian Cage against Sting in this case, what the story that AEW has been telling since its existence is that there is no way for Sting to win, because
absolutely
our in-ring stuff makes sense. Like, what you see is going to match what should actually happen if you're just thinking about it in your brain. And when we swerve you, it's a swerve that ultimately makes sense, like MJF forming the Pinnacle, just as an example. But going back to what Craig said, where sometimes you just have to take the criticism on the chin for the interest of building over time, maybe I was a little bit too quick to judge by saying that Ricky Starks should have gone over against Sting, and it's a mistake, because ultimately, if Sting is going to serve the greater purpose of putting over a star that AEW has tagged as being an even bigger star than Ricky Starks, if he's going to put over Adam Page or Jungle Boy or MJF or someone like that, where Ricky Starks, AEW saying, okay, he's like a upper mid-card or maybe main eventer, we'll see, but those three guys, these guys are going to be world champions at some point in their AEW tenure. We're going to build them into megastars. If that's going to be the long-term plan, then, like you said, Craig, sometimes you do just have to do it, and, people are going to criticize you, but ultimately a year down the road, if MJF beats him, no one's going to remember that Sting beat Ricky Starks, because MJF just went over on Sting.
I think he's probably going to lose before that to Lance Archer, if I go by the promo on Dynamite. Yeah.
Well, that would go back to that would go back to exactly what we were saying just a second ago about you see Lance Archer, and this is a guy who throws people through ceilings. So there's no chance that a 60-year-old can beat him. But for what it's worth, Lance Archer, I thought that was a phenomenal promo from him. I think it was the best
really
promo
was.
he's had
Yeah.
in AEW.
He could
Totally
also
agree.
use being rebuilt somewhat. He lost a bit of his monster image, and he's kind of a bit middling, I would suggest, at the moment. So maybe Sting gets fed to him, and then he beats Allen and becomes a bit of a dominant TNT champion for a bit, perhaps.
The big problem they've had is they've let him talk, because why would you bring in Jake the Snake Roberts to talk for you and then give the man the microphone? It's just pointless. So instead, you just got Jake hanging around looking creepy.
Jake
that's
doesn't
true.
seem necessary. I like Lance Archer as a talker. I think he's good.
I agree with
totally
that.
agree.
I think when Jake Roberts came in, he cut a fantastic promo when he debuted. And you remember there was that line where he said, never turn your back on a man you fear or respect. And then he turned around and threw the microphone behind him. Like that was a great promo from him. But like both of you said, what we learned later is Lance Archer is a great talker. So he doesn't need Jake Roberts. Put Jake Roberts with a guy who can't talk, because Jake Roberts can talk. And not only that, but I think Lance Archer, beyond just the kayfabe stuff where he would need someone to talk for him, from a shoot perspective, in terms of do you need to pair him with a guy who knows the industry, who can kind of help him along develop? Lance Archer's a veteran. He's been around a long, long time. He's traveled the world. He's done everything. So you didn't even need Lance Archer to help him adjust to this level of professional wrestling, because Lance Archer's been there, done that. So to me, what they should do is quietly separate the two. I don't think it needs to be like a feud or a turn or something like that. Just separate it. Yep, Lance Archer going by himself, and then pair Jake Roberts up with a younger guy who would need some help behind the scenes, kind of adjusting, get some advice from a guy like Jake Roberts, who's been around for a long time, for decades long, and Jake Roberts can talk for him and really have a more meaningful spot on TV.
And it doesn't even have to be a guy they've got now. They can just, keep Jake on hand. You can have him producing.
Yeah.
And then if you want to use him on TV in the future, you've got that option.
Well, I think it's been pretty well known that Roberts has been helping a lot of the younger guys. I think there was a picture going around a few weeks ago of Roberts in Daly's place right before a taping of Dynamite, I think it was, where he was sitting down with a bunch of Nightmare Factory wrestlers and kind of talking them through stuff. And to me, that's great, because this is a dude who's been wrestling since the 80s. And like, this guy has seen everything. And not only just from the perspective of Roberts was an innovative wrestler in his own right, some of the things that he invented and got over in terms of the ring psychology, there might be no one better than Jake Roberts. But also, from a life perspective, we know that Jake Roberts has made a lot of mistakes in his life, and it almost went really badly for him on several occasions. And so a guy who has been able to turn his life around the way that Jake Roberts has, finally now, it's great to see. But just to add that level of perspective as well, not only on wrestling but on life in general, about staying grounded, I think Jake Roberts is such a valuable person to have around. And so I think you're right. If he needs to be off TV for a little while until they find the guy that they can pair up with him, or, pair him up with a woman if you want to. I don't really care. Just find someone that you can pair up with him. Until then, I think he's a very valuable set of hands to have around.
Absolutely.
Can't fault that logic.
The last thing that I want to talk about here is the New Japan Cup. And the finals happened a little less than a week ago. Will Ospreay, Will Ospreay, spoilers, is won the New Japan Cup, so he is going to face Kota Ibushi at, Craig, remind me the name of the event.
Sakura Genesis,
Yes.
I believe.
Yes, I think that's right. So obviously there has been so much talk about the angle of that match by the end. And to me, that's been litigated a lot in the court of public opinion, so I'm not so interested with the reaction to that. What I am interested in is how you book Will Ospreay going forward after this whole New Japan Cup run, after the match he has that was, I think, a great match and really told a great story at the end of the day. Craig, how would you book him going forward?
I would fire him into the sun until he learns how to conduct himself a bit better. Sorry, that's not very helpful. I don't want to go back and forth about the issue. However, it is more important than wrestling, and I think that's the issue that people are grappling with.
He shouldn't have been in the match in the first place.
But yeah, potentially. I would have debated that before now, but I'm struggling more and more now. If you don't understand, seek out the Super J Cast. Find the tweet where Joel from the Super J Cast asked for women that have watched it to provide their kind of reception of that angle. And you can go through it and read about people that were affected by it. It might not seem like a big deal. It might just, she's a trained wrestler. Why are you making a fuss? It's not really about the impact on her. There was no impact on her, really. She knew it was coming. She was happy to do it. The issue is when these kind of stories are told in traditional media, you tend to have an idea of what is coming. It does not just burst out the screen at you. And often there is a trigger warning. That didn't happen. So they were kind of normalizing that kind of act of violence within a relationship. That's why people are upset. If it didn't upset you, fine. It didn't upset me. I didn't even think, oh, that's domestic violence. I just thought, oh, that's a bit rubbish. And then I saw the reaction online, thought about it, and went, oh, yeah, that's not good. Shouldn't be normalized like that. What was telling for me was when I was telling my partner about it, she went domestic abuse in her mind immediately. That's the difference in gender. We're privileged as men that we don't think like that a lot of the time because we're not kind of under that kind of social pressure. I said I wasn't going to go into a huge amount of detail. Sorry, it irks me.
Well, the issue. I mean, I'm not saying that you're not entitled to say whatever you want, whatever you feel about it. That's totally fine. What I want to get into now is it has already happened. So, the debate about whether or not it should have happened to me is separate from the discussion about what we do now.
Yes. I think I'm worried. I don't think it's over. I think something else is coming, whether she helps him win a match and it was all a ruse, or if she shows up and I don't know. I think it's going to have all been a ruse, but that's not really the point. I think she might appear in his match against Ibushi. In terms of the match, it was a good match. It was Will Ospreay doing ridiculous things against Shingo Takagi, who is consensus-based the best wrestler of 2021. For people that have perhaps been watching a plethora of different wrestling promotions, I would suggest that most people would say that he's been the best. I wanted him to win. I thought he might. There was interactions between him and Ibushi. It seems like they were priming him to, go up against Ibushi. Wasn't the case. Will Ospreay is a tremendous wrestler. I don't think he'll beat Ibushi yet, but he might. The company are definitely behind him. In terms of this match, it's the third time that they have come together. The first being that famous Best of the Super Juniors final, which won the Voices of Wrestling match of 2019.
Yep.
They also had a G1 Climax match last year. So Ospreay won the Best of the Super Juniors. Takagi beat him in the G1. And then this is Ospreay winning the kind of rubber match.
Yeah.
60-40 split, Ospreay. 94 strikes from Ospreay in this 30-minute match. Big number.
Wow.
7 dives from Ospreay, who is changing his style, but he still pulled off 7 dives, which is only marginally less than the 9 that he used a couple of years ago. So yeah, very interesting. A lot of interesting discourse around Ospreay and how he's changing his style. But I think it's just he's making things mean more. but the dives are still happening.
Yeah, and I think like in his Wrestle Kingdom match with Okada, I think that was very much a similar story where when he did those traditional Will Ospreay things, they meant a lot more because before he's going a mile a minute, so he does a Sasuke special followed up with an Acai moonsault, and it all happens in like 10 seconds, and it's like very little time to process anything. But the difference between Will Ospreay as a junior and Will Ospreay now as a heavyweight is not that he's wrestling a lot differently, to your point, but that his psychology is a lot better. He's thinking a lot more about what he's doing and how he can get the most out of being Will Ospreay, being one of the best pure athletes in the world. And I think that's a real credit to him that he has improved so much just in terms of his psychology. When it comes to Ospreay going forward, I think this is something that we discussed last week on the podcast. New Japan and pretty much every wrestling company around the globe right now, they are obviously very aware that there is so much movement in terms of talent. And we've seen AEW, for example, get flooded with talent, excuse me, from other places. Impact, obviously, so many of those WWE guys that were released mid 2020, they ended up in Impact. So I think New Japan is very conscious of the fact that Will Ospreay, he's not Japanese. A lot of his friends are in AEW right now. And so they might be looking at, how do we reward Will Ospreay for being so loyal to this company when he's not from the country, he doesn't speak the language, he easily could have gone somewhere else. And I think that's kind of playing into this. I don't know if he's going to beat Ibushi. In fact, I agree with you, Craig, he probably won't. But that idea that he has been so loyal this whole time, I think New Japan is very aware of that, and that is playing into how we're seeing Ospreay booked.
If he does win, I wouldn't be surprised, and it will be for exactly the reason you've just said. But I also think the way they booked Ibushi, if he had a flash loss, he could come back and take it, whenever you wanted to do it straight away.
They do that as well in New Japan. Absolutely. They like to use that title to establish people. There was a spell a few years ago where it kind of bounced around between Styles, Naito, and Okada to kind of position all the leaders of the various factions.
Yeah, that's a good point. And in this particular case, if the thinking is long-term, we've heard lots of reporting from different sources about who might show up in the States now that the door is open, so to speak. If the question is who's going to show up, Ibushi's name has been thrown out a whole lot, and I do want to point this out. It may mean absolutely nothing, but obviously, Pro Wrestling Musings, check out the website, prowrestlingmusings.com. We overanalyze stuff. So this is something that I heard in Omega's match with Sydal on Dynamite. Omega hits the One-Winged Angel, and the line for 2 years has been, no one has ever kicked out of the One-Winged Angel. Excalibur has said it every time. No one kicks out of the One-Winged Angel. This time, Excalibur said only one man has kicked out of the One-Winged Angel. And it wasn't because it got kicked out of. It was because Ibushi is the man. Ibushi is the only man to kick out of that move ever, anywhere. And is it coincidental that we start to reference the fact that Kota Ibushi exists? I mean, obviously, AEW has made reference to New Japan several times, but we're now referencing specifically an accomplishment of Kota Ibushi. Is that a coincidence now that the door's open? It may very well be, but it's just something that I thought of. And if that is going to be the future, if Ibushi is going to come to the States again and wrestle in AEW, or if Okada's going to do it, are they going to put the title on Ospreay to make sure that Ospreay stays in Japan as their champion? Does that mean that Ospreay doesn't have interest in coming to the States right now? I mean, I think there's a lot of questions to be asked, but it means that from a booking perspective, we have no idea what's going on. We don't know if Ospreay is going to win. But also from a non-kayfabe perspective, from a shoot perspective, we really don't know what's going to happen, and if they're going to put the title on Ospreay for other reasons. And I think that just makes it more interesting.
I would be surprised if Ospreay moved though, because I know he moved lock,
Mhm.
stock, and barrel out to Japan,
Yeah.
and it's
Right.
quite a big thing to relocate your whole life again just within a couple of years. So I think he's probably staying there for a good few years, like I think Jay White is.
Right. Well, so
Yeah.
I am
I think
wondering if Ibushi and Okada, I mean, obviously they're both from Japan. So for them, it would kind of be, a trip over to the States to compete here. And I'm not thinking they would be here long term. I'm thinking probably a couple months each. But that would be kind of like almost a vacation for them, like an excursion. New Japan's famous for doing those. So it would be kind of something like that. Whereas Ospreay and Jay White, to your point, they've moved to Japan. They're not from the country. So it's a big deal for them. And they're going to want to stay in the area for the immediate future. So you would put the title on Ospreay so that he's there, and like you said, Ibushi can survive a loss.
Yeah, it depends how valuable this Kenny Omega Ibushi thing is to New Japan. Like, is it more valuable to their Western expansion to put the title on Ospreay so that they have their kind of the guy that is with them that can reach into a lot of the American British market?
Mm-hmm.
Or do they want to aim for the most buzzworthy match they possibly can get, and that is Omega versus Ibushi, most likely.
Yeah.
Where that happens, who knows? Perhaps it's likely that they would do it in both places, more than one match.
Mm-hmm.
But how much New Japan really gain from Omega taking on Ibushi, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting question that you pose. I think from New Japan's perspective, if they're going to expand, if they want to continue this expansion out west, they're obviously developing more and more and more English-speaking talent. Obviously, you have Will Ospreay, Jay White, Jeff Cobb, Zack Sabre Jr., guys that can really connect with Western audiences because they speak the language. But that's not to say that New Japan doesn't have people who don't speak the language that could still connect with the audience. I mean, I love Kazuchika Okada personally. He's actually the first New Japan wrestler that I was introduced to, and there's just something about him that even though I don't speak Japanese, so even though I don't know what he's saying most of the time, it doesn't matter. Like, he just has this personality, he kind of has that air about him. And so that's a guy, and we know that people like Dave Meltzer and other journalists have reported this, where he has seriously considered and reportedly wants to come over to the States and wrestle here. And
he's done it. He's done everything. He's done everything in Japan. Like, he's the most decorated New Japan wrestler ever.
Yeah.
The only thing he's not done is number of title wins. Like, he's held it for the longest. He's defended it the most.
Yeah.
He's got the most combined days. So, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if he did a stint somewhere.
Yeah, and I think he would really work, again, because he doesn't have to speak the language to connect with Western audiences.
Although I'm not sure Kazuchika Okada and Jake the Snake are... I'm not sure how well they go together.
Yeah, maybe save that for another guy that comes over. I don't think... To me, I would love to see Okada come over, and I don't think he has to talk much. I mean, I think he knows a little English. I've heard him speak English before, so he knows it a little bit. But I think you could go kind of the Orange Cassidy route with him, where less is more. And he doesn't have to speak. He has the presence. I mean, he is Kazuchika Okada. He's like one of the greatest wrestlers that ever lived. And so you don't need him to talk. And when he does talk, I want that moment, just like when Orange Cassidy in that debate with Chris Jericho, when he finally opens his mouth and like everyone is just stunned at what, because Orange Cassidy doesn't talk. I want that to be the moment for Okada. Obviously in a more serious situation than Orange Cassidy did it, but that moment where Okada finally speaks, that should be a really big moment. And Okada's one of the few guys who just has the physical charisma to really pull that off.
Interesting proposition. Yeah, I'm assuming we're talking AEW. You've not explicitly said it, but they'd make it work.
I mean, it could be Impact as well. That's been brought up when it comes to Okada.
Okay.
I don't know how much you'd want to go back there. Funnily enough.
Yeah, well, probably not. But I mean, to be fair, it's like a totally different company at this point. So maybe he would. I don't know. I'm throwing things out there. Impact has been brought up, and obviously that's where FinJuice went as well when they came here. There's another example of two Western guys who went to New Japan, became really successful. So it's an option. I don't want to automatically go to AEW when we're talking about all this, just because that's the easy thing to say. We see it every time. Like for example, when Andrade just got released from WWE, everyone's thinking Andrade to AEW. Like that's the automatic one. And so if you're talking Okada, automatically you're thinking Okada to AEW. I'm just thinking there are more options out there for him.
Yeah, there are, but if Okada wants to go to America to wrestle, and he chooses Impact, and we get a main event run of Okada in Impact where he's taking on Rich Swann and Moose, rather than Hangman Adam Page, Kenny Omega, Phoenix, then I might cry. Just saying.
All right, I guess if you put it that way, then it doesn't. It doesn't. But now that you mention it, can you imagine Okada versus Rey Fenix? I mean, like that. I'd probably just stop watching wrestling because I don't know if any match could ever get to those heights ever.
You would, that's something special there.
I'd want to say that's the last match I ever watched. Like I don't care, I'd be like 26 or whatever. I'm like that's the last wrestling match I'm ever gonna watch.
Fair enough.
And that's just one of them. I mean, we can talk about dream matches all day. But you know what? The dream matches, that's a topic for, I think, a completely different show. Because this show is about over. We've talked AEW, we've talked New Japan, and we've had a lot of fun while doing it. And I want to say to both of you, thank you so much for being here. This was a lot of fun. And I'm going to go to both of you. Scott first. Scott, where can the people find you?
I'm on Twitter at Scottster21.
Go follow Scott. Tremendous follow. Craig, where can the people find you?
Where can the people find me? Everywhere that has wrestling stuff. So if you want to Twitter, it's Craig PW Musings. Please check out the PW Musings Twitter account. It's got all of our content. Our website as well, ProWrestlingMusings.com, has lots of cool stuff on it as well, the kind of stats that we've been talking about. There's really well worth looking at Wrestling's Greatest Rivalries, issue 3, Ricky Steamboat versus Ric Flair, which has been cool. Every week before Dynamite, please check out Styles Make Fights from Sergey Alderman. He kind of uses the statistics that we've been gathering to show what you might expect to see. It's a good way to get things thinking. We are also doing a roundtable now, which is short, snappy takes about each week's Dynamite. Mm-hmm. You will also find Griff's videos and power rankings often linked together, where we kind of think about the impact that various AEW wrestlers are making, alongside kind of deep dive videos. Why Cody Rhodes Isn't Over was one, and the very well received how they actually fixed that finish. I'm sure you can guess what that finish was. Something was supposed to explode. It perhaps did not do so. I think that's most of it. Trying to do Instagram, PW Musings there. It's just all the stats and things that people have been doing. You'll see it popping up on Reddit as well.
Yeah, so in a general sense,
Griff,
if you
what about yourself?
Well, I'm glad that you asked.
What about you, Griff?
If you like wrestling at all, then you owe it to yourself. Head on over to ProWrestlingMusings.com. You can see all of the things that Craig just said. For me, personally, you can find me on Twitter at GriffFromGA, and go check out my own YouTube channel over at General Admission Wrestling. I have a lot of fun over there. And I have a lot of fun here doing this podcast every week with you guys. Thank you all so much. If you have been listening, share this, give it a review on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, subscribe over on our YouTube channel over at Pro Wrestling Musings, and just enjoy things with us. Wrestling is fun. Wrestling is just fun, and that is what we discover every single week here on this podcast. We just love talking about professional wrestling. So if you love professional wrestling, then do all of those things that we just told you to do. Go follow all of those things that we just told you to follow, and check back every week for more episodes of Pro Wrestling Musings. Thank you all so much. Once again, Scott and Craig, thank you so much for being here with us. We will see you all next week. We appreciate you.